Rachel stood at the door in her stilettos, adjusting her coat just enough to show off the figure-hugging burgundy dress underneath. "Don't wait up," she said with a smirk, tossing her hair over her shoulder like punctuation. Her perfume lingered even after the door clicked shut. Supposedly a girl's night out? Marcus knew better. He waited exactly 3 seconds before rising from the couch, reaching under the cushion to pull out a folded slip of paper. On it, 3 names, 2 addresses, and a number. The locksmith. No drama, no confrontation, just execution. Upstairs, his suitcase was already half-packed, concealed beneath a layer of untouched sweaters. Marcus moved with calm precision, pulling shirts from their hangers, pairing his shoes, stacking his toiletries with quiet efficiency. Every action was intentional, deliberate. It wasn't rage that moved him. It was clarity. On the kitchen table sat a sealed envelope. Inside, printed screenshots, texts between Rachel and a man saved only as J, photos of receipts for hotel rooms. One of them featured a smudge of her lipstick in a kiss shape right next to the date. The smoking gun. Glossy red. Marcus had found it all weeks ago, but tonight was execution day. He dialed the locksmith. By the time the man arrived, Marcus had already disabled the garage remote and changed the passcodes to the smart security system. The locks took 30 minutes to replace. Just enough time for Marcus to sit in silence, sipping his last coffee in that house as her husband. The suburban home had always looked perfect from the outside, manicured lawn, matching porch chairs, but inside, it had been crumbling for months. Now, it would become something new, a place where he wasn't being lied to. By 10:43 p.m., Rachel's name was blocked on his phone, her access to the joint bank account revoked. Her iPad wiped clean. He walked to the bedroom window and peered out at the driveway. Empty, for now. He took a final walk through the house, absorbing the silence. No more fake apologies, no more pretending, just peace, like a still lake after a storm. He slipped a single house key into a small white envelope and set it gently on the coffee table. Not for her, for himself. It was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming everything she thought he'd given up. The next morning, the house was still. Rachel hadn't returned. Yet. But Marcus wasn't counting minutes. He'd stopped waiting long ago. He stood barefoot in the center of their walk-in closet, running his eyes along the rack of dresses she'd once paraded in front of him for compliments she no longer valued. He remembered a time when their choices, paint colors, duvet covers, vacation destinations, felt like shared dreams. Now, even the texture of her perfume in the air made his skin crawl. It was strange how quickly resentment could rot something once sacred. He took his time removing the remaining pieces of his presents. A framed photo of them from their 5th anniversary, back when her smile reached her eyes. A book she once gifted him but never saw him finish. His grandfather's watch, long buried in a drawer beneath Rachel's overflowing jewelry box. Every item Marcus packed was a memory he was choosing to carry forward, not because of her, but because they belonged to him. That distinction mattered now. By midday, the house was nearly sterile. Her world remained untouched, as if he'd never existed within it. His drawers were empty, the medicine cabinet cleared, even his side of the bed was stripped to the mattress. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. This wasn't a breakup. This was an erasure, a reclamation. In the kitchen, he transferred the remaining funds from their joint account into a private one he'd opened weeks ago. The moment her betrayal had gone from suspicion to fact, he began preparing. Marcus wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. Where Rachel thought she'd married a doormat, she was now realizing she'd been sleeping beside a strategist. He printed the final set of bank statements, highlighting transfers she'd made to a travel fund she once claimed was for their anniversary trip. Funny how the dates matched her rendezvous weekends. He left those documents on the counter in a plain folder, no note, no explanation, just facts, lined up like quiet daggers. Then he moved to the foyer. The key hook still held the spare she never used, just in case. He pocketed it before removing her access from the smart lock app. She wouldn't be entering again without his permission. He changed the Wi-Fi password, logged out of the Nest camera account on her devices, and cleared every shared calendar. Rachel's digital fingerprints vanished one by one, erased with cold precision. By sunset, Marcus was dressed in a soft gray sweater and dark jeans, suitcase by his side, coffee in hand. The house was clean, too clean, the kind of clean that wasn't sterile but deliberate, like an art gallery emptied for a new exhibit. He sat by the window, the same seat he'd occupied countless mornings before work, only this time with a serenity that felt earned. His phone remained silent. He knew Rachel hadn't noticed yet. Too distracted by her affair, too sure he'd always be waiting when she was done playing house with someone else. But the silence wouldn't last. She'd come home expecting everything to be as she left it. She always did. And that's what made this moment so satisfying, because the world she thought she controlled was already gone. He didn't need revenge that screamed or broke things. He needed precision and time. And he'd use both with the patience of a surgeon. Now, all that remained was the reveal, not for drama, not for closure, for the undeniable moment when she realized that Marcus, the man she underestimated for years, had already left without slamming a single door. The night Rachel returned, the street was soaked in amber from the streetlights, her luxury sedan gliding into the driveway like it always had. Her heels hit the pavement with the same practiced rhythm, her silhouette framed by confidence, unearned, as always. She didn't notice anything different at first. The porch lights flicked on automatically, and the welcome mat still sat perfectly centered in front of the door, but as she reached into her handbag and pressed the familiar digits into the keypad, the first crack in her world appeared. Access denied. She tried again, slower this time. Same result. Her brow furrowed. Then, with a scoff, she pulled out her key and jammed it into the lock, but it stopped halfway, no longer a match. Rachel's smirk faded. She jiggled it once. Twice. Then a third time, now with a little panic blooming behind her perfectly lined eyes. Inside, Marcus sat still. The lights were off, except for one lamp in the hallway. His coffee had long since cooled, but he didn't move to warm it. He was waiting, not for her, but for the moment itself. The inevitable reckoning. Outside, the pounding began. "Marcus!" she yelled, her voice muffled but unmistakably laced with disbelief. "What the hell is going on? Open the door." He didn't flinch. Not a twitch. He watched her from behind the curtain, his expression unreadable, almost tranquil. There was something poetic about her standing there. Hair slightly tousled from the wind, her evening makeup smudging at the edges. Fury in her fists as they crashed against the very door she once slammed in his face, metaphorically. Night after night. "Marcus, this isn't funny. Let me in." Still, nothing. She pulled out her phone, tried to call. It went straight to voicemail. She texted, "We need to talk. Let me in now." The message stayed unread. Rachel screamed again, then paused as if waiting for the door to swing open. But it didn't. And in that silence, the truth crept in. The man she thought too passive to ever act had left her behind, without ever leaving the house. Then the lock clicked, the door opened just a crack. Marcus stepped out, suitcase in hand, jacket draped casually over one arm. He didn't look surprised to see her, he looked free. Rachel blinked, startled by his calm. "Marcus, what is this? Are you serious right now?" He looked her dead in the eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, no pain, just closure. And then he lifted his hand, not in protest, not in farewell, but in a slow, deliberate wave, a gesture so small, yet so final, it cut through her voice like glass. She reached for him instinctively, but he took a single step back. That space between them, just 2 feet wide, felt like an ocean, a line she could no longer cross. He said nothing, didn't have to. Her reflection in his silence told her everything. And then without a word, Marcus turned, walked to his car, placed the suitcase in the trunk, and slid behind the wheel. Rachel stood frozen, her mouth open, maybe to beg, maybe to explain, but he didn't look back. The engine started, the car eased into reverse, then turned toward the street. The driveway was empty again. The door remained closed. And Rachel, heels unsteady on the welcome mat, tears finally breaching the walls of her pride, realized she was locked out not just from a house, but from a life she thought she'd always control. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat in her car parked just down the street, watching the house like it might blink, like it might open its doors and say it was all a mistake. But the light stayed off, and the silence wrapped around her like a vice. She tried calling again, no answer. She checked his social media, wiped clean. His accounts were either deactivated or blocked. Even the shared Dropbox they used for home documents showed a final message. "This folder is no longer available." Panic began to trickle in, not a flood, but a slow, maddening drip. By morning, she drove to her best friend's house, desperate to make sense of it. But halfway through her explanation, trying to spin herself as the victim, her friend cut her off with a look. "You thought he'd never leave," she said, arms folded. "You treated him like he was an option. Now he's gone, and you don't get to act surprised." Rachel didn't respond. She couldn't. The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Later that day, she went to her office hoping routine would ground her, but even there she found signs of his absence. Their joint business checking account was locked. HR informed her that her auto pay benefits, which Marcus had set up through his firm, were no longer active. Her email pinged with a message from their financial advisor. Rachel, please, call to schedule an individual consultation. Per Marcus' request, we've separated all assets. She stared at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't just a breakup. This was a full extraction. Still, denial clung to her like a perfume gone sour. She texted him again. You made your point. Now let's talk like adults. No response. Another text. You can't just vanish after everything we've been through. What? She tried calling from a different number. Straight to voicemail. She paced her office, muttering justifications to herself. He's being dramatic. He's hurt. He'll come back. But every door she knocked on had already been shut. Quietly, completely. Then came the final twist. A week later, she ran into her affair partner, James, in the parking lot of the hotel where they used to meet. He was walking with someone else, a brunette, younger, laughing at something he'd said. When Rachel approached, James barely blinked. Hey, she said, trying to sound casual. He looked at her like he was trying to remember her name. Rachel, she added, voice faltering. We should talk. And James shrugged. I thought you said your husband would never find out. Guess you were wrong. Before she could respond, he was already walking away. No apology, no regret, just indifference. She stood there stunned. James had moved on, easily, effortlessly. And now Marcus had too. The difference was that James never cared. Marcus did, and she broke that. That night, Rachel returned to the house one more time. She parked across the street and just stared. The curtains were drawn. A different car sat in the driveway. A rental, maybe. Or maybe he'd already bought something new. The grass looked freshly trimmed, mailbox empty, lights on inside. Life was moving forward without her. She stepped out of her car, heels sinking slightly into the grass, and walked to the edge of the property. She didn't dare ring the bell again. Something in her knew there'd be no answer. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out the old house key, the one that no longer fit, and placed it gently on the step. She didn't know why. Maybe it was a symbol. Maybe it was surrender. Either way, she turned and walked back toward her car, the click of her heels sounding less like power now and more like echoes of a woman who no longer had a place to come home to. It had been 3 weeks. Marcus sat at a small cafe overlooking the edge of the city, a place he'd discovered on a quiet drive the morning after he left. The sky above was pale gray, the kind that suggested rain but never quite committed. He liked it that way. Indecisive weather for a man who no longer hesitated. His phone buzzed once. A new number. He didn't check it. There were no more strings left to pull him back. No more curiosity about what she might say or which version of herself she'd try to become. He had learned that silence could speak for him now, louder, sharper, more final than any confrontation ever could. A server placed a small ceramic dish beside his cup, a single key. His spare. The one Rachel had left on the step that day. He'd found it 2 mornings later, exactly where she'd placed it. He didn't pick it up out of sentiment. He picked it up because it no longer belonged to her and never would again. Now, it rested on the cafe table, not as a memory, but as a memento of closure, a quiet trophy from a war he'd never wanted but refused to lose. He watched the world move beyond the glass. A couple laughed over their coffee nearby. A child tugged at their parents' coat to point at birds scattering across the sidewalk. Life continued in ordinary ways. And Marcus felt the weight of something extraordinary. Freedom, not as a gesture, but as a reality. He pulled out a small notebook from his coat pocket, the one he'd started the night he changed the locks. On the first page, he'd written, I will leave without shouting. I will leave without looking back. And now, as he stared at the final page, he added just one more line. You said I'd never leave. I just didn't tell you when. He closed the notebook, left the key on the table, and stood. Without hurry, he walked out into the quiet morning. No applause, no audience, just the steady sound of footsteps from a man who had finally walked away and made sure she knew he was never coming back.